Harold Jameson walked slowly through the busy Chicago airport. His old boots made soft sounds on the shiny floor. People rushed past him carrying expensive bags and talking on their phones. Harold looked very different from everyone else. He wore old blue jeans with small holes in them. His shirt was simple and clean, but not fancy. His jacket was brown and looked like he had worn it for many years. On his head sat an old baseball cap. His hands were rough and had small cuts from working outside. His face was dark from spending time in the sun. Other people in the airport wore nice suits and fancy dresses. They carried leather bags and wore shiny shoes. When they saw Harold, some of them moved away from him. Others looked at him with strange faces. A few people whispered to each other and pointed at him. Harold did not seem to care what people thought. He walked with quiet confidence. In his back pocket he carried a small leather wallet. In his front pocket was his phone. But the most important thing he carried was in his jacket pocket. It was his airplane ticket. The airport was very busy that morning. Hundreds of people were trying to catch their flights. Long lines formed at every counter. People looked tired and worried about missing their planes. Harold joined one of the lines and waited patiently. The woman in front of him kept looking back at him. She had perfectly done hair and wore expensive clothes. Her perfume smelled strong. She moved her purse to her other arm when she saw Harold behind her. She seemed uncomfortable. Behind Harold stood a man in a dark business suit. The man talked loudly on his phone about important meetings and big money deals. He looked at Harold like he did not belong there. The man even asked Harold if he was in the right line. Harold just smiled and nodded. He did not say much to anyone. He preferred to watch and listen. This was something he had learned to do very well over the years. When Harold finally reached the check-in counter, the young woman working there looked surprised. She had blonde hair and wore the airline uniform. Her name tag said Jennifer. She looked at Harold from his old boots to his worn baseball cap. "Can I help you?" Jennifer asked. Her voice sounded like she was not sure Harold should be there. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ticket. He placed it gently on the counter. Jennifer picked it up and looked at it carefully. Her eyes got very wide when she read it. "This is a first-class ticket," she said, looking confused. "Yes, it is," Harold replied simply. Jennifer looked at the ticket again. Then she looked at Harold. Then back at the ticket. She seemed to think there was some kind of mistake. "Sir, this ticket costs over $2,000, she said quietly. Harold nodded. "I know." Jennifer typed something into her computer. She frowned at the screen. Then she typed some more. Other people in line behind Harold started to get impatient. They checked their watches and sighed loudly. "Is there a problem?" Harold asked politely. "Well, no, sir. Everything seems to be in order," Jennifer said, but she still looked confused. "It's just that, well, this is a very expensive ticket." Harold understood what she was really thinking. She thought he could not afford such an expensive ticket. She thought maybe he had stolen it or found it somewhere, or maybe someone had made a mistake. "The ticket is mine," Harold said calmly. "I bought it myself." Jennifer nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. I'm sorry. Let me print your boarding pass." The printer made noise as it printed Harold's boarding pass. Jennifer handed it to him along with his ticket. She still looked puzzled. "You'll be in seat 2A, she said. "That's in the front of the plane. First class." "Thank you," Harold said. He took his documents and put them in his jacket pocket. As Harold walked away from the counter, he heard Jennifer talking to her coworker. "That was strange," she whispered. "That old farmer had a first-class ticket. How do you think he got it?" Harold pretended not to hear them. He had heard comments like this many times before. People always judged him by how he looked. They saw his simple clothes and thought he had no money. They saw his rough hands and thought he was just a simple farm worker. But Harold knew something they did not know. He knew that looks could be very deceiving. He knew that some of the richest people in the world dressed very simply. He also knew that some people who looked rich actually had very little money. Harold found a quiet place to sit while he waited for his flight. He pulled out a small notebook and a pen. He wrote down the time and what had happened at the check-in counter. He wrote about how Jennifer had acted and what she had said. This was something Harold did every time he traveled. He took careful notes about everything that happened. He noticed how people treated him. He watched how employees did their jobs. He paid attention to every detail. A family with 2 small children sat down near Harold. The children were loud and excited about flying on the airplane. Their mother tried to keep them quiet. Their father read a newspaper. One of the children, a little girl with curly hair, looked at Harold and smiled. Harold smiled back. The little girl whispered something to her mother and pointed at Harold. The mother looked at Harold and then pulled her daughter closer to her. "Don't talk to strangers," she whispered to the child. Harold felt sad about this. He loved children and would never hurt anyone. But he understood why the mother was careful. She did not know him. She only saw an old man in simple clothes. After waiting for 30 minutes, Harold heard his flight number being called. It was time to board the airplane. He stood up slowly and put his notebook back in his pocket. He walked toward the gate where people were lining up to get on the plane. The gate agent announced that first-class passengers could board first. Harold showed his boarding pass and walked down the long hallway to the airplane. Behind him, he could hear people talking about the old man in front of them. "I wonder how he got that first-class ticket," one person said. "Maybe he won it in a contest," said another. Harold just kept walking. He knew that soon, very soon, he would be on the airplane, and then the real story would begin. Harold stepped onto the airplane and looked around. The inside was very nice. The seats in first class were big and comfortable. They were covered in soft leather. Each seat had its own small television screen and lots of space for legs. A flight attendant stood at the front of the plane greeting passengers. She was tall and had dark hair pulled back perfectly. Her makeup was done very well. Her uniform was neat and clean. Her name tag said Jessica Martinez. She smiled at each person as they walked past her. When Harold approached, Jessica's smile changed. It became smaller and less real. She looked at Harold from his old boots to his baseball cap. Her eyes showed that she was not happy to see him. "Excuse me, sir," Jessica said in a voice that was not very friendly. "I think you might be in the wrong section of the plane." Harold stopped walking and looked at her. "I don't think so," he said politely. Jessica pointed toward the back of the airplane. "Economy class is that way, sir. This section is for first-class passengers only." Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. He showed it to Jessica. She took it from him and looked at it carefully. "This says seat 2A, Jessica said, sounding surprised. "Yes, it does," Harold replied. Jessica looked at the boarding pass again. Then she looked at Harold. She seemed to think there was some kind of mistake. "Are you sure this is your boarding pass?" she asked. "I'm very sure," Harold said calmly. Jessica held the boarding pass up to the light like she was checking if it was real. Other passengers behind Harold were getting impatient. They wanted to find their seats and put away their bags. "Sir, this is a very expensive seat," Jessica said quietly. "I know," Harold replied. Jessica looked around like she was looking for help. Another flight attendant named Maria came over to see what was happening. "Is there a problem?" Maria asked. "This gentleman has a first-class boarding pass," Jessica said, "but I think there might be some mistake." Maria looked at Harold and then at the boarding pass. "The pass looks real to me," she said. Jessica frowned. "But look at him," she whispered to Maria. Harold heard what Jessica said. It made him feel sad and a little angry. But he had learned long ago to stay calm when people treated him badly because of how he looked. "The boarding pass is mine," Harold said firmly. "I bought my ticket and checked in at the counter. Everything is correct." Jessica gave Harold back his boarding pass. "Fine," she said. "Your seat is right there." She pointed to a seat by the window. Harold walked to his seat and sat down. The seat was very comfortable. He put his small bag under the seat in front of him. Then he pulled out his notebook and wrote down what had just happened. Other first-class passengers were now boarding the plane. They all wore expensive clothes and carried fancy bags. Jessica smiled brightly at each of them and welcomed them warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said to a man in a dark suit. "It's wonderful to see you again." "Hello, Mrs. Davidson," she said to a woman with a diamond necklace. "How was your trip to Paris?" Harold noticed how differently Jessica treated these passengers compared to how she had treated him. She was friendly and helpful to them. With him, she had been suspicious and rude. A businessman sat down in the seat next to Harold. He wore an expensive watch and shiny shoes. When he saw Harold, he looked surprised. "I think you're in the wrong seat," the businessman said. "No, this is my seat," Harold replied, showing his boarding pass. The businessman looked at the boarding pass and shook his head. "I don't understand," he said. "How did you afford a first-class ticket?" Harold did not answer. He just looked out the window and continued writing in his notebook. More passengers kept boarding the plane. Every time someone new saw Harold in first class, they looked surprised. Some of them whispered to each other. Harold could hear them talking about him. "What is that farmer doing in first class?" One woman asked her husband. "Maybe he won the lottery," the husband replied. "Or maybe someone gave him the ticket by mistake," another passenger suggested. Jessica heard these comments too. She seemed to agree with what the passengers were saying. She kept looking at Harold like he was a problem she needed to solve. After all the passengers were seated, Jessica made an announcement about safety. She showed everyone where the emergency exits were and how to use the seatbelts. When she finished, she started checking on the first-class passengers. She went to each passenger and asked if they needed anything. She offered them drinks and snacks. She was very polite and helpful to everyone. When Jessica came to Harold, her attitude changed again. She did not smile at him like she smiled at the other passengers. "Do you need anything?" she asked in a flat voice. "Just some water, please," Harold said politely. Jessica nodded and moved on to the next passenger. Harold noticed that she brought water to everyone else right away. But she waited until last to bring his water. When she finally brought Harold his water, she set it down hard on his tray table. Some of the water spilled out of the cup. "Sorry," Jessica said, but she did not sound sorry at all. Harold cleaned up the spilled water with a napkin. He did not complain. He just wrote another note in his notebook. The businessman sitting next to Harold watched all of this happen. He started to feel uncomfortable about how Jessica was treating Harold. "That wasn't very nice," the businessman whispered to Harold. Harold just nodded and continued writing. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Jessica walked through first class one more time. She made sure everyone had their seatbelts on and their seats in the right position. When she got to Harold, she stood there for a long time looking at him. "Sir, are you sure you're supposed to be in this seat?" she asked again. "I'm very sure," Harold replied. Jessica made a frustrated sound and walked away. Harold could hear her talking to Maria in the back of the first-class section. "I don't understand how he can afford that seat," Jessica said. "He looks like he just came from working on a farm." "Maybe we should just let it go," Maria suggested. "His ticket seems real." "But what if other passengers complain?" Jessica asked. "What if they think we're not keeping first class exclusive enough?" Harold listened to their conversation and felt more sad. He had hoped that people would be kinder on this flight. But it seemed like he was going to face the same problems he always faced when he traveled. The plane's engines started making noise. Harold looked out the window and saw the ground crew preparing the airplane for takeoff. Soon they would be in the air. Harold thought about his farm back home in Nebraska. He thought about his simple life there where people knew him and respected him. He thought about how different things would be if these people knew who he really was. But Harold had decided long ago that he would not change how he dressed or acted just to make other people more comfortable. He believed that people should be treated with kindness no matter what they looked like or where they came from. As the plane started moving toward the runway, Harold closed his notebook and put it in his pocket. He had written down everything that had happened so far. Soon there would be much more to write about. Jessica walked past his seat one more time. She still had that unfriendly look on her face. Harold just smiled at her and looked out the window. The plane lifted off the ground and climbed into the sky. Harold's journey was just beginning. The airplane was now flying high in the sky. Harold looked out his window at the white clouds below. The view was beautiful and peaceful. Inside the plane, however, things were not peaceful at all. Jessica continued to treat Harold badly throughout the flight. She seemed to enjoy making him uncomfortable. Every time she walked past his seat, she gave him unfriendly looks. About an hour into the flight, Jessica came around with drinks for the first-class passengers. She had a silver cart filled with expensive wines, fresh juice, and sparkling water. "What would you like to drink, Mr. Thompson?" she asked the businessman with a big smile. "I'll have some champagne, please," Mr. Thompson replied. Jessica poured him a glass of expensive champagne in a real glass cup. She served it with a small plate of fancy nuts. She moved to the next passenger, an older woman wearing pearls and a beautiful dress. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Davidson. What can I get for you?" Jessica asked sweetly. "Some white wine would be lovely," Mrs. Davidson said. Jessica gave her a glass of wine and some cheese and crackers on a nice plate. When Jessica reached Harold, her whole attitude changed. Her smile disappeared. Her voice became cold. "What do you want?" she asked rudely. "Could I have some orange juice, please?" Harold asked politely. Jessica poured orange juice into a plastic cup instead of a glass one like the other passengers had received. She did not offer Harold any snacks. She just set the plastic cup down on his tray table without being careful. Harold noticed the difference in how he was being treated. But he said nothing. He just took a sip of his orange juice and wrote another note in his notebook. The businessman sitting next to Harold saw everything that happened. He felt embarrassed for Harold and angry at Jessica. "Excuse me," the businessman said to Jessica. "Why did you give him a plastic cup when everyone else got glass cups?" Jessica looked annoyed. "We ran out of glass cups," she lied. But the businessman could see the cart was still full of glass cups. He shook his head and looked away. Later in the flight, Jessica brought lunch to the first-class passengers. She had several different meal choices for everyone to pick from. "Mr. Thompson, would you like the salmon or the beef?" she asked nicely. "The salmon looks wonderful," Mr. Thompson replied. Jessica served him a beautiful plate of salmon with vegetables and rice. The food looked delicious and was presented very nicely. "Mrs. Davidson, what would you prefer?" Jessica asked the woman with pearls. "The beef, please," Mrs. Davidson said. Jessica gave her a perfectly prepared beef dish with mashed potatoes and green beans. When Jessica got to Harold, she did not ask him what he wanted. She just put a plate down in front of him without saying anything. Harold looked at his plate. The food was different from what the other passengers had received. His meal looked like airplane food from economy class. The meat was dry and the vegetables were overcooked. "Excuse me," Harold said politely. "Could I see the menu?" Jessica looked annoyed. "This is what we have left," she said rudely. "But you asked the other passengers what they wanted," Harold pointed out. "Well, you're getting what's available," Jessica said loudly. Her voice was loud enough for other passengers to hear. Several passengers turned to look at what was happening. Harold felt embarrassed, but he tried not to show it. "I would just like to see my options, please," Harold said calmly. Jessica rolled her eyes. "Fine," she said. She grabbed a menu from her cart and threw it down on Harold's tray table. Harold looked at the menu. There were 3 meal choices available. He had been given the cheapest option without being asked. "I would like the salmon." "Please," Harold said. "We don't have any left," Jessica lied again. But Harold could see salmon meals still on her cart. Other passengers could see them too. Everyone knew Jessica was lying. An older gentleman sitting across the aisle spoke up. "Young lady, I can see salmon meals on your cart right there." Jessica's face turned red. She was caught in her lie. "Those are reserved for other passengers," she said defensively. "Reserved for which passengers?" the gentleman asked. Jessica did not have a good answer. She just stood there looking angry and embarrassed. Finally, she grabbed a salmon meal from her cart and slammed it down in front of Harold. "There," she said rudely. "Thank you," Harold said quietly. After Jessica walked away, several passengers started whispering about what they had just seen. "That was terrible," one woman said to her husband. "She's treating that poor man very badly." Another passenger said, "Someone should report her to the Airline," suggested a third passenger. Harold heard these comments, but he just ate his lunch quietly and continued writing in his notebook. He was recording everything that was happening. About halfway through the flight, Harold got up to use the bathroom. As he walked down the aisle, he accidentally bumped into Jessica, who was carrying a pitcher of water. "Watch where you're going," Jessica said loudly, even though the bump was very small and was clearly an accident. "I'm sorry," Harold said politely. Jessica made a big show of checking her uniform to see if any water had spilled on it. "You need to be more careful," she said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Other passengers watched this interaction with surprise. Harold had barely touched Jessica, and his apology had been sincere. Her reaction was much too dramatic. When Harold returned from the bathroom, he found that someone had spilled water all over his seat. The leather was wet and there was water pooling on the cushion. "What happened here?" Harold asked Jessica, who was standing nearby. "Oh, I accidentally spilled some water while you were gone," Jessica said, but she did not sound sorry at all. "I'll get you a towel." Jessica brought Harold a small paper towel that was not nearly big enough to clean up all the water. Harold had to use several towels to dry his seat. As Harold was cleaning up the water, Jessica spoke loudly to another flight attendant. "Some passengers just don't know how to behave in first class," she said, making sure Harold could hear her. "They're not used to nice things," the other flight attendant replied, also speaking loudly. "You can tell just by looking at them that they don't belong here," Jessica continued. Harold stopped cleaning and looked at Jessica. For the first time during the flight, he looked a little angry, but he controlled himself and went back to drying his seat. Other passengers were becoming very uncomfortable watching Jessica treat Harold so badly. Several of them started talking among themselves about what they should do. "This is unacceptable," whispered Mrs. Davidson to her husband. "That flight attendant should be fired," said Mr. Thompson to the man next to him. "I'm going to write a complaint letter to the Airline," announced another passenger. But Jessica did not seem to care what the other passengers thought. She continued to be rude to Harold throughout the rest of the flight. When she collected meal trays, she roughly grabbed Harold's tray without asking if he was finished. When she offered more drinks to passengers, she skipped Harold completely. When passengers asked for extra pillows or blankets, she was happy to help them. But when Harold asked for a blanket because he was cold, she told him there were none available. Harold noticed everything Jessica did. He wrote down every rude comment and every poor treatment in his notebook. He also noticed how the other passengers were reacting to Jessica's behavior. By the end of the flight, most of the first-class passengers were disgusted with how Jessica had treated Harold. They had seen enough to know that something was very wrong, but Jessica seemed proud of how she had acted. She appeared to think she was protecting first class from someone who did not belong there. What Jessica did not know was that her behavior was being carefully documented. Harold's notebook was now full of detailed notes about everything that had happened during the flight. As the plane began to descend toward their destination, Harold looked out the window again. Soon they would be landing. Soon Jessica would learn something that would change her life forever. Harold put his notebook back in his pocket and prepared for landing. The most important part of this journey was still to come. As the airplane continued flying toward its destination, Harold felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled out a special satellite phone that worked even high in the sky. Most passengers on the plane had never seen a phone like this before. The phone was bigger than a regular cell phone and had a thick antenna. These phones cost a lot of money and were usually only used by very important business people or government officials. Harold looked at the screen and saw an important call coming in. He pressed the button to answer. "Hello, this is Harold," he said quietly into the phone. Jessica was walking past Harold's seat when she heard him talking. She stopped and listened to his conversation. She rolled her eyes and shook her head like she thought Harold was pretending to be someone important. "Yes, I got the quarterly reports you sent me," Harold said into the phone. "The numbers look good for the third quarter." Jessica made a face like she did not believe what she was hearing. She thought Harold was just pretending to have an important business call. "What about the new routes we discussed?" Harold continued. "Are we still planning to add flights to Denver and Seattle next month?" Some of the other passengers started listening to Harold's conversation too. They were surprised to hear him talking about business things that sounded very real and detailed. "Good," Harold said. "And how are our customer satisfaction scores?" "I hope they're improving after the changes we made to our service standards." Jessica walked closer to Harold's seat so she could hear better. She wanted to prove to herself that Harold was just making up this conversation. "I see," Harold said, looking serious. "If our scores are still low, we need to do more training with our flight attendants. Some of them don't understand how important it is to treat every passenger with respect." Jessica's face turned red when she heard this. She felt like Harold was talking about her on purpose. No, Harold continued. "I don't care if a passenger is wearing expensive clothes or simple clothes. Everyone who buys a ticket deserves to be treated well. That's what our company stands for." The businessman sitting next to Harold was now listening very carefully. The way Harold talked about airline business sounded like he really knew what he was talking about. "Let me ask you about something else," Harold said into the phone. "Have you been getting any complaint letters about our flight attendants? I want to know if passengers are happy with our service." Jessica moved even closer to Harold's seat. She was trying to hear every word of his conversation. "That's not good," Harold said, frowning. If passengers are complaining about rude flight attendants, we need to fix that problem right away. Our reputation depends on good customer service. Harold paused to listen to the person on the other end of the phone. While he listened, he pulled out his notebook and wrote down some numbers. Okay, here's what I want you to do, Harold continued. Set up a meeting with all the flight attendant supervisors for next week. We need to review our training programs and make sure everyone understands our service standards. Mrs. Davidson, the woman with pearls, was now listening to Harold's conversation too. She was surprised by how much Harold seemed to know about running an airline. And another thing, Harold said, I want you to start doing more surprise inspections on our flights. Send people to fly on our planes without telling the crew who they are. That way we can see how our employees really behave when they think no one important is watching. Jessica's eyes got very wide when she heard this. The idea of surprise inspection scared her. Yes, I think that's the best way to find out the truth about our service quality, Harold continued. Our employees should treat every passenger well, not just the ones they think are important. Harold looked directly at Jessica while he said this. She quickly looked away and pretended to be busy with something else. Now, about the board meeting next Friday, Harold said. Make sure all the directors have copies of the financial reports. And remind them that we're discussing the employee performance review system. The other passengers were now very interested in Harold's conversation. They were starting to realize that maybe Harold was not just a simple farmer after all. I also want to talk about our hiring policies, Harold continued. We need to make sure we're hiring flight attendants who understand that good customer service means treating all passengers equally, no matter what they look like or how they're dressed. Jessica felt like Harold was talking directly about her. She was getting more and more uncomfortable. That's right, Harold said. I don't care if a passenger is wearing a business suit or farm clothes. Everyone deserves the same level of service. That's not negotiable. Mr. Thompson, the businessman, whispered to his wife. This man sounds like he really knows the airline business. Yes, she whispered back. He talks like someone who's in charge of important decisions. Harold continued his phone conversation for several more minutes. He talked about fuel costs, airplane maintenance schedules, and employee benefits. Everything he said sounded very professional and detailed. One more thing, Harold said near the end of his call. I want you to review the personnel files of all our flight attendants. If any of them have received complaints about poor treatment of passengers, I want to know about it immediately. Jessica felt her heart start beating faster. She had received several complaints from passengers in the past few months. I don't care if they've been with the company for a long time, Harold continued. If someone can't treat passengers with respect, they shouldn't be working for us. Our company values are more important than anything else. Harold looked around the first-class cabin while he talked. His eyes stopped on Jessica for a moment, but she quickly looked away. All right, I'll see you at the office on Monday, Harold said. Make sure everything we discuss gets done before then. This is very important to me. Harold hung up his phone and put it back in his pocket. The first-class cabin was very quiet. All the passengers had been listening to his conversation, and they were all thinking about what they had heard. Jessica walked away from Harold's seat quickly. She was very confused and a little scared. Harold had talked about the airline business like someone who was in charge of making important decisions. But she still could not believe that the man in old farm clothes could be anyone important. That was interesting, the businessman said quietly to Harold. Harold just smiled and nodded. He did not explain anything about his phone call. Mrs. Davidson leaned over from her seat. You seem to know a lot about the airline business, she said politely. I've been involved with airlines for many years, Harold replied simply. What kind of work do you do? Asked another passenger. Harold thought for a moment before answering. I work with airline management, he said. This was true, but he did not explain exactly what his role was. Jessica was now talking quietly with Maria, the other flight attendant in the back of the first-class section. Did you hear that phone call? Jessica whispered. Yes, Maria replied. He sounded like he knew what he was talking about. But look at him, Jessica said. He's just an old farmer. He can't be anyone important in the airline business. Maybe he's not what he seems, Maria suggested. Don't be silly, Jessica said. People who run airlines wear expensive suits and carry leather briefcases. They don't dress like they just came from working in a field. But Maria was not so sure. She had been a flight attendant for many years, and she had learned that appearances could be deceiving. Meanwhile, Harold pulled out his notebook again and wrote down some more observations about the flight. He also made a note about Jessica's reaction to his phone call. The plane would be landing soon, and Harold knew that the most interesting part of this journey was still ahead. He looked out the window at the ground below and smiled slightly. Jessica had no idea what was coming next. The airplane began its descent toward the airport. Harold could see the runway getting closer through his window. The flight was almost over, but Harold knew the most important part was about to begin. The captain's voice came over the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Denver International Airport. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your seats are in the upright position." Harold fastened his seatbelt and put his notebook away. He had filled many pages with detailed notes about everything that had happened during the flight. Every rude comment from Jessica, every time she had treated him differently from other passengers, every lie she had told, it was all written down. As the plane got closer to the ground, Harold's satellite phone rang again. He answered it quietly. "Yes, this is Harold," he said. "Sir, this is Robert from Ground Operations," said the voice on the phone. "Everything is ready for your arrival. We have the conference room prepared, and all the staff members you requested are waiting." "Good," Harold replied. "And did you contact the flight crew supervisor?" "Yes, sir. She'll be there when you land. She's very excited to meet with you." "What about the passenger service manager?" Harold asked. "He's already at the airport waiting for you, sir. Everyone is very eager to see you." Jessica was walking past Harold's seat when she heard this conversation. She stopped to listen again, just like she had done during his earlier phone call. "Perfect," Harold said. "And remember, I want this to be a learning experience for everyone involved. This is not just about punishment. It's about making sure we provide the best possible service to all our customers." "Understood, sir," Robert replied. "We'll handle everything exactly as you instructed." "I'll see you in a few minutes," Harold said and hung up the phone. Jessica looked very confused. She could not understand why people seemed to be preparing some kind of special meeting for Harold. In her mind, he was just an old farmer who somehow got a first-class ticket. The airplane touched down on the runway with a gentle bump. Harold looked out his window and saw several airport vehicles driving alongside the plane. This was unusual. Normally, only regular ground crew vehicles met incoming flights. As the plane slowed down and moved toward the gate, the captain made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated after we reach the gate. We have a special presentation today, and all passengers are requested to stay in their seats until it is completed. This will only take a few minutes. Thank you for your cooperation." The passengers looked at each other with confusion. No one had ever heard of a special presentation after a flight before. They wondered what was happening. "What kind of presentation?" Mrs. Davidson asked her husband. "I have no idea," he replied. "This is very unusual." Jessica was also confused by the captain's announcement. She had been a flight attendant for 5 years, and she had never experienced anything like this before. The airplane came to a stop at the gate, but the passengers stayed in their seats as the captain had requested. Everyone was curious about what was going to happen next. Harold sat calmly in his seat. Unlike the other passengers, he did not look confused or curious. He looked like someone who knew exactly what was going to happen. A few minutes after the plane stopped, the cockpit door opened. Captain Rodriguez stepped out, followed by his co-pilot. They both looked very serious and a little nervous. Captain Rodriguez walked directly to Harold's seat. When he reached Harold, he stood up straight and spoke in a very respectful voice. "Mr. Jameson," the captain said, "it's an honor to have you on our flight today. I apologize that we didn't recognize you earlier." All the passengers in first class turned to look at Harold. They were shocked to hear the captain speaking to him with such respect. Jessica's mouth fell open. She could not believe what she was hearing. The captain was treating Harold like he was someone very important. "Thank you, Captain Rodriguez," Harold replied calmly. "You and your crew did an excellent job flying the plane today." "Thank you, sir," the captain said. "We have some people waiting to meet with you in the airport. Are you ready to proceed?" "Yes, I think it's time," Harold said. Harold stood up from his seat and straightened his simple jacket. Even though he was still wearing his old clothes, something about him seemed different now. He stood with confidence and authority. The other passengers watched in amazement. The man they had thought was just a simple farmer was clearly someone very important, but they still did not know who he was or why the captain was treating him with such respect. Jessica stood in the aisle, completely confused. She kept looking back and forth between Harold and the captain, trying to understand what was happening. "Excuse me, Captain," Jessica said in a shaky voice. "Who is this man?" Captain Rodriguez looked at Jessica with surprise. "You don't know who this is?" he asked. "No, sir," Jessica replied. "He's just a passenger. He bought a first-class ticket, but he looks like a farmer." The captain's expression changed. He looked shocked that Jessica did not recognize Harold. "This is Harold Jameson," the captain said slowly. Jessica's face showed that this name meant nothing to her. She still looked completely confused. "I'm sorry, sir," Jessica said. "I don't understand why that name is important." The captain stared at Jessica in disbelief. "You work for this airline and you don't know who Harold Jameson is?" "No, sir," Jessica replied honestly. Harold stepped forward and spoke to Jessica directly for the first time since the flight began. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in the airport," Harold said calmly. "I think there are some things we need to discuss." "Discuss?" Jessica asked nervously. "What do we need to discuss?" "We need to talk about customer service," Harold replied, "and about how employees of this airline should treat all passengers." Jessica was getting more confused and more nervous. She could not understand why this farmer wanted to talk to her about customer service. The cockpit door opened again, and two people in business suits entered the first-class cabin. They walked directly to Harold and greeted him with great respect. "Mr. Jameson," said the first person, a woman with short gray hair. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, the airport passenger service manager. We're ready for you in conference room A." "And I'm David Chen, the flight crew supervisor," said the second person, a man in a dark suit. "All the staff members you requested are waiting." The passengers watched this scene with growing amazement. These airport officials were treating Harold like he was the most important person they had ever met. Jessica's face had turned very pale. She was beginning to realize that she had made a terrible mistake. Harold was not just a simple farmer. He was someone very important to the airline. "Before we go," Harold said to Sarah and David, "I want to make sure all the passengers understand what's happening here." Harold turned to face all the first-class passengers. When he spoke, his voice was clear and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold began, "I want to thank you for flying with us today. I hope you had a pleasant flight." The passengers nodded politely, but they were all still very confused about what was happening. "Some of you may have noticed that there were some problems with customer service during this flight," Harold continued. "I want you to know that this airline takes customer service very seriously, and we will be addressing these problems immediately." Jessica realized that Harold was talking about her behavior during the flight. Her hands started shaking and she felt sick to her stomach. "I also want you to know," Harold said, "that every passenger on this airline deserves to be treated with respect and kindness, regardless of how they look or what they wear." Harold looked directly at Jessica as he said this. She could not meet his eyes. "Now," Harold concluded, "we have some business to take care of in the airport. Thank you again for flying with us." Harold walked toward the front of the plane, followed by Captain Rodriguez, Sarah, and David. As he passed Jessica, he stopped for a moment. "Miss Martinez," he said quietly, "please come with us. We have a lot to discuss." Jessica's legs felt weak, but she followed Harold off the plane. She still did not know exactly who Harold was, but she knew she was in serious trouble. The other passengers remained in their seats, talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. They all realized they had been part of something very unusual and important. As Harold walked through the jet bridge toward the airport, he thought about everything that had happened during the flight. Soon Jessica would learn the truth about who he really was, and soon she would understand the consequences of treating passengers badly based on how they looked. The most dramatic part of this story was about to begin. Harold walked through the airport terminal with confident steps. Behind him followed Captain Rodriguez, Sarah Mitchell, David Chen, and a very nervous Jessica Martinez. Other airport workers stopped what they were doing to watch this unusual group walk by. Jessica noticed that many airport employees seemed to recognize Harold. Some of them nodded respectfully as he passed. Others whispered to each other and pointed at him. A few even stopped their work completely to watch him walk by. Why is everyone staring at him? Jessica wondered to herself. She was getting more confused and more worried with each step. They walked through several hallways and past many gates until they reached a section of the airport that Jessica had never seen before. There was a door marked Executive Conference Room A, authorized personnel only. Sarah Mitchell opened the door with a special key card. Inside was a large conference room with a long wooden table surrounded by leather chairs. The room had big windows that looked out over the airport runways. Several people were already waiting in the room. They all stood up when Harold entered, and they all greeted him with great respect. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jameson," said a woman in a business suit. "I'm Linda Parker, the Regional Customer Service Director." "Hello, Mr. Jameson," said a man with gray hair. "I'm James Wilson, the head of human resources for this region." "Welcome, sir," said another woman. "I'm Michelle Torres, the flight attendant training supervisor." Jessica watched all of these introductions with growing shock. These were all very high-ranking people in the airline company. She had heard their names before in company meetings and employee newsletters. They were some of the most important managers in the entire airline, and they were all treating Harold like he was their boss. "Please, everyone sit down," Harold said calmly. Everyone took seats around the conference table. Harold sat at the head of the table like someone in charge of a meeting. Jessica was told to sit in a chair facing Harold. "Before we begin," Harold said, "I want to make sure Miss Martinez understands why we're all here." Harold looked directly at Jessica. "Miss Martinez, do you know who I am?" Jessica's voice was very quiet when she answered. "No, sir. I thought you were just a passenger." "That's correct," Harold said. "I was a passenger on your flight today, but I'm also something else." Harold paused and looked around the room at all the managers. They all looked very serious. "Miss Martinez," Harold continued, "I am Harold Jameson, the founder and owner of this airline." Jessica felt like someone had hit her in the stomach. She could not breathe for a moment. The room started spinning around her. "The owner?" she whispered. "That's right," Harold replied. "I started this airline 30 years ago with one small airplane. Today we have over 200 planes and fly to 150 cities around the world." Jessica's face turned completely white. She realized that she had been treating the owner of the airline like he was nobody important. She had been rude to him, lied to him, and embarrassed him in front of other passengers. "I don't understand," Jessica said in a shaky voice. "Why were you dressed like a farmer?" Harold finished her sentence. "Because I am a farmer. I own a farm in Nebraska where I grew up. Even though I also own this airline, I never forgot where I came from." Harold stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the airplanes on the runway. "You see, Miss Martinez," Harold continued, "I believe that how a person dresses doesn't tell you anything about who they really are. Some of the richest people in the world dress very simply. Some of the kindest people wear old clothes. Some of the smartest people don't care about expensive things." Harold turned back to face Jessica. "But you judged me completely based on my clothes. You decided I didn't belong in first class because I wasn't wearing a fancy suit." Jessica wanted to say something, but no words came out of her mouth. She felt terrible about how she had acted. "Let me tell you something about this airline," Harold said. "When I started this company, I made a promise that we would treat every single passenger with respect and kindness. It doesn't matter if they're rich or poor, young or old, wearing expensive clothes or simple clothes. Everyone deserves good service." Linda Parker, the customer service director, opened a folder and pulled out several papers. "Mr. Jameson," she said, "we've been receiving complaints about Miss Martinez for several months. Passengers have written letters saying she treats people differently based on how they look." Jessica's heart sank even lower. She had not realized that passengers had been complaining about her. "What kind of complaints?" Harold asked. Linda read from the papers. One passenger wrote that Miss Martinez was rude to an elderly man because he was wearing old clothes. Another passenger complained that she gave better service to people wearing expensive jewelry. And last month, a passenger said she made comments about people who don't belong in first class. Harold shook his head sadly. "This is exactly the opposite of what our airline stands for." James Wilson, the human resources manager, spoke up. "Miss Martinez, these complaints show a pattern of discriminatory behavior. This is very serious." Jessica finally found her voice. I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't realize I was doing anything wrong." "You didn't realize?" Harold asked, sounding surprised. "You didn't realize that giving me a plastic cup while giving everyone else glass cups was wrong? You didn't realize that lying about what meals were available was wrong? You didn't realize that spilling water on my seat on purpose was wrong?" Harold pulled out his notebook and opened it. "I wrote down everything that happened during the flight today. Every rude comment, every lie, every time you treated me differently from other passengers. Harold began reading from his notebook. At 10:15 a.m., Miss Martinez told me I was in the wrong section of the plane, even though I showed her my boarding pass. At 11:30 a.m., she gave me a plastic cup while serving everyone else with glass cups. At 12:45 p.m., she lied about what meals were available and tried to give me the cheapest option without asking what I wanted. Harold continued reading for several minutes. The list of problems was very long. Everyone in the room could see that Jessica had treated Harold very badly throughout the entire flight. I also wrote down how the other passengers reacted to your behavior, Harold added. Several of them said they were going to write complaint letters about how you treated me. They were disgusted by your behavior. Michelle Torres, the training supervisor, looked very disappointed. Miss Martinez, did you not pay attention during your customer service training? We specifically teach that all passengers should be treated equally. I thought, Jessica started to say, but then stopped. She realized that there was no good excuse for how she had acted. You thought what? Harold asked. I thought that people in first class should look a certain way, Jessica admitted quietly. And what way is that? Harold asked. Wealthy, successful, important, Jessica replied. Harold sat back down at the table. Miss Martinez, let me tell you something about wealth and success and importance. The richest man I know wears the same old jacket every day. The most successful businesswoman I know drives a car that's 15 years old. The most important person in my life is my wife, who grows vegetables in our garden and cans them for the winter. Harold paused to let this sink in. Real wealth, success, and importance have nothing to do with fancy clothes or expensive accessories. They have to do with how you treat other people and what you contribute to the world. Sarah Mitchell spoke up. Mr. Jameson regularly flies on our planes without telling anyone who he is. He does this so he can see how our employees really behave when they think no one important is watching. That's right, Harold confirmed. And unfortunately, what I saw today was completely unacceptable. Miss Martinez, you violated every principle that this airline was built on. Jessica began to cry. She realized that her behavior had not only hurt Harold, but had also damaged the reputation of the airline and disappointed all of these managers. What happens now? Jessica asked through her tears. Harold looked around the room at all the managers. They all looked back at him, waiting to hear what he would decide. The most difficult part of this meeting was about to begin. Harold stood up slowly and walked around the conference table. Everyone in the room watched him carefully, waiting to hear what he would say. Jessica sat with tears streaming down her face, knowing that her career was probably over. Miss Martinez? Harold began, his voice calm but serious. What you did today was not just rude behavior. It was discrimination. You treated me badly because of how I looked. And that is never acceptable. Jessica nodded, unable to speak through her tears. However, Harold continued, I want you to understand something important. This meeting is not just about punishing you. It's about teaching you and everyone else a valuable lesson. Harold walked to a large screen on the wall and turned it on. Pictures of the airline appeared, photos of airplanes, employees, and passengers from all around the world. Let me tell you the story of this airline, Harold said. 30 years ago, I was just a young farmer in Nebraska. I had a small farm, but I also had a dream. I wanted to start an airline that would treat every passenger like they were the most important person in the world. Harold clicked to the next picture, which showed a very old and small airplane. This was my first plane, Harold said. It was used and had many problems, but it was all I could afford. I flew it myself and served snacks to passengers. I cleaned the seats and checked people in at the counter. Jessica looked up at the picture with surprise. She had never heard this story before. I remember one of my first passengers, Harold continued. She was an elderly woman wearing a simple dress and carrying an old suitcase. Other airlines had treated her poorly because she didn't look wealthy. But I treated her like a queen. I helped her with her bags, made sure she was comfortable, and talked with her during the flight. Harold smiled at the memory. That woman became one of my most loyal customers. She flew with my airline for 20 years and told all her friends about the good service she received. She helped my business grow. Harold clicked to more pictures showing the airline growing bigger over the years. As my airline grew, I made a promise, Harold said. I promised that we would never judge passengers by their appearance. We would treat a farmer in old clothes the same way we treat a businessman in an expensive suit. We would treat a student with a backpack the same way we treat a millionaire with a diamond necklace. James Wilson, the human resources manager, nodded. That promise became our company motto. Every passenger matters, every journey counts. That's right, Harold said. And Miss Martinez, today you broke that promise. You violated the most important principle of our company. Harold walked back to Jessica and sat down across from her. But I want you to understand why this matters so much to me personally. Harold's voice became softer. You see, when I was a young man, I experienced discrimination myself. People looked at my farm clothes and decided I wasn't important. Banks wouldn't lend me money for my airline because I looked like just a farmer. Investors laughed at me because I didn't wear expensive suits. Jessica listened carefully to every word Harold said. I know exactly how it feels to be judged by your appearance. Harold continued. I know how it feels when people treat you like you don't matter. And I promised myself that my airline would never make anyone feel that way. Harold pulled out his notebook again. But today you made me feel exactly the way those people made me feel 30 years ago. You made me feel like I didn't belong, like I wasn't good enough, like I was somehow less important than other passengers. Jessica felt even worse hearing this. She had not realized that her behavior had actually hurt Harold's feelings. I'm so sorry, Jessica whispered. I never meant to hurt your feelings. I know you didn't mean to, Harold replied. But impact matters more than intention. Even if you didn't mean to hurt me, you did. And more importantly, you've been hurting other passengers for months. Linda Parker opened her folder again. Miss Martinez, we have complaint letters from 17 different passengers over the past 6 months. All of them describe the same pattern of behavior, treating people differently based on their appearance. 17? Jessica asked in shock. She had no idea so many people had complained about her. Yes, Linda replied. And those are just the people who took the time to write letters. There are probably many more passengers who were upset but didn't complain. Michelle Torres, the training supervisor, spoke up. Miss Martinez, do you remember your customer service training? We spent an entire day talking about treating all passengers equally. Jessica nodded. Yes, I remember. Then why didn't you follow that training? Michelle asked. Jessica thought for a moment before answering. I guess I thought the training was just theory. I didn't think it really mattered in real life. Harold shook his head sadly. Miss Martinez, that training is not theory. It's the foundation of everything we do. When you ignore that training, you damage our company's reputation and hurt innocent people. Harold stood up and walked to the window again. He looked out at the airplanes and thought about all the passengers who flew on his airline every day. Let me tell you something else, Harold said. Some of our best customers are people who don't look wealthy or important. We have a mechanic from Detroit who flies with us every month to visit his sick mother. We have a teacher from small town who saves money all year to take her students on educational trips. We have a veteran who wears the same old jacket every time he flies to visit his grandchildren. Harold turned back to face the room. These people trust us with their hard-earned money. They choose our airline because they believe we will treat them well. When you treat them badly because of how they look, you betray that trust. David Chen, the flight crew supervisor, had been quiet during most of the meeting. Now he spoke up. Miss Martinez, he said, I want you to know that Captain Rodriguez reported your behavior today. He was very upset about how you treated Mr. Jameson. He said it was the most unprofessional behavior he had ever seen from a flight attendant. Jessica felt ashamed. She had always respected Captain Rodriguez and was sad to know that he was disappointed in her. Captain Rodriguez has been flying for our airline for 15 years, David continued. He said that your behavior today went against everything our company stands for. Harold returned to his seat at the head of the table. Miss Martinez, I want to ask you a question. Do you understand now why your behavior was so wrong? Jessica wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. Yes, sir. I judged you based on your clothes instead of treating you like a valued customer. I violated the company's principles and hurt your feelings. I also hurt other passengers and damaged the airline's reputation. That's right, Harold said. And what do you think should happen as a result of your behavior? Jessica knew what the answer was, but it was hard for her to say it. I think I should be fired. Harold nodded slowly. Yes, Miss Martinez. Your employment with this airline is terminated. Effective immediately. Jessica started crying again, but she knew that Harold was making the right decision. However, Harold continued, I want to use this situation as a learning opportunity for everyone else. Harold looked around the room at all the managers. I want every flight attendant in our company to hear about what happened today. I want them to understand that discriminating against passengers based on appearance will not be tolerated. We'll make sure that happens, Michelle Torres promised. And I want to change our training program, Harold added. From now on, every new employee will learn about the importance of treating all passengers equally, regardless of their appearance. That's an excellent idea, James Wilson agreed. Harold turned back to Jessica. Miss Martinez, even though you can no longer work for this airline, I hope you've learned something important today. I hope you'll remember this lesson and treat people better in the future, whatever job you have. Jessica nodded. I will, sir. I promise I will. Harold stood up one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our meeting. Miss Martinez, please see Mr. Wilson about your final paperwork. As everyone prepared to leave the conference room, Harold had one more thing to say. Remember, he told all the managers, every passenger who flies with us deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That's not just good business, it's the right thing to do. The meeting was over, but the impact of what had happened would be felt throughout the airline for years to come. 2 weeks later, Harold was back on his farm in Nebraska. He stood in his vegetable garden, wearing the same old clothes he had worn on the airplane. The morning sun was warm on his face as he picked tomatoes and put them in a basket. His wife Martha came outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She was a simple woman who had been married to Harold for 40 years. She wore a plain dress and had her gray hair tied back in a simple ponytail. How are the tomatoes looking this year? Martha asked, handing Harold a cup of coffee. Very good, Harold replied, taking a sip. This has been a great year for the garden. Martha smiled. It's nice to have you home for a few days. You've been traveling a lot lately. Harold nodded. Yes, but it's important work. I need to see how our employees are treating our passengers. Martha knew about Harold's recent flight and what had happened with Jessica Martinez. She was proud of how her husband had handled the situation. Did you hear anything more about that flight attendant? Martha asked. Yes, Harold said sadly. Jessica is having trouble finding a new job. Word got around the airline industry about what happened. Other airlines are worried about hiring someone who discriminates against passengers. That's unfortunate, Martha said, but maybe it will help her learn to be a better person. Harold hoped so too. He had not enjoyed firing Jessica, but he knew it was necessary to protect his other passengers and maintain the airline's values. Harold's phone rang. It was Sarah Mitchell, the passenger service manager. Good morning, Mr. Jameson, Sarah said. I wanted to give you an update on the changes we've made since your flight. What kind of changes? Harold asked. Well, first, we've retrained every flight attendant in the company. We told them all about what happened and emphasized the importance of treating all passengers equally. Good, Harold said. How did they react? Most of them were shocked that a fellow employee had behaved so badly. They promised to do better. We also had a few employees who admitted they had sometimes judged passengers by their appearance. They thanked us for the reminder about our company values. Harold was pleased to hear this. What else have you done? We've created a new training program for all new employees. Every person who works for the airline now learns about the importance of not judging people by how they look. We use your story as an example. That's excellent, Harold said. I hope it helps prevent future problems. We've also started a new program where managers take surprise flights to observe employee behavior, Sarah continued. We want to make sure our employees are following company policies even when they think no one important is watching. This made Harold very happy. That's exactly what we need to do. And Mr. Jameson, Sarah added, we've received over 100 letters from passengers who were on your flight that day. They all wrote to say how impressed they were with how you handled the situation. Harold was surprised. What did they say? They said they were proud to fly with an airline that takes customer service so seriously. Many of them said they will only fly with us from now on because they know we treat all passengers with respect. Harold smiled. Sometimes good things came from bad situations. Oh, and one more thing, Sarah said. Mrs. Davidson, the woman with the pearls who was sitting in first class? She wrote a very special letter. What did she say? Harold asked. She said that watching how you handled Jessica's behavior taught her not to judge people by their appearance. She admitted that she had been guilty of the same thing Jessica did. She promised to treat all people better in the future. Harold felt very good about this. If his experience had helped even one person become kinder to others, then something positive had come from the difficult situation. After Harold finished his phone call, He continued working in his garden. He thought about Jessica and wondered how she was doing. He hoped she was learning from her mistakes and would become a better person. That afternoon, Harold received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Jessica Martinez. "Dear Mr. Jameson," the letter began, "I want to thank you for the lesson you taught me. I know that sounds strange since you fired me, but I mean it sincerely." Harold continued reading. "After I lost my job, I spent a lot of time thinking about my behavior. I realized that I had been judging people my whole life based on how they looked. I had been treating people differently based on their clothes, their age, their race, and many other things. I found a new job working at a restaurant," the letter continued. "Every day I remember the lesson you taught me. I treat every customer with kindness and respect no matter what they look like. My manager has complimented me several times on my customer service." Harold was happy to read this. Jessica was learning and growing from her mistake. "I also wanted to tell you," Jessica wrote, "that I have been volunteering at a homeless shelter on weekends. I serve food to people who sometimes look very poor or dirty. Before our experience on the airplane, I might have been uncomfortable around these people, but now I see them as human beings who deserve kindness and respect." Harold smiled as he read this part. Jessica was becoming a better person. "I know I can never work for your airline again," the letter concluded, "but I want you to know that you changed my life. You taught me that a person's worth has nothing to do with their appearance. You taught me that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Thank you for that lesson, even though it was painful to learn." The letter was signed, "Respectfully yours, Jessica Martinez." Harold showed the letter to Martha. She read it carefully and then looked at her husband with pride. "You did the right thing," Martha said. "You helped that young woman become a better person." "I hope so," Harold replied. "Everyone deserves a second chance to learn and grow." That evening, Harold and Martha sat on their porch watching the sunset. Harold was still wearing his old farm clothes, just as he had been that morning and just as he would tomorrow. "You know," Martha said, "some people might think it's strange that the owner of a major airline lives so simply." Harold laughed. "Let them think what they want. I know who I am and you know who I am. That's all that matters. Besides," Harold added, "if I dressed like a rich businessman all the time, I would never learn how my employees really behave. Sometimes the best way to see the truth is to look like someone ordinary." Martha nodded. She was proud to be married to a man who had never forgotten his humble beginnings, even after becoming very successful. A month later, Harold received a call from a television reporter who had heard about the incident on the airplane. The reporter wanted to interview Harold about what had happened. "I don't think that's necessary," Harold told the reporter. "This wasn't about getting attention for myself. It was about making sure our passengers are treated well." "But sir," the reporter said, "your story could inspire other business owners to treat their customers better." Harold thought about this for a moment. "If you want to tell the story, that's fine. But please focus on the lesson, not on me personally. The important message is that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance." The story was eventually published in several newspapers and magazines. It inspired many other business owners to examine how their employees treated customers. Several companies changed their training programs to emphasize the importance of not judging people by their appearance. Harold continued to take surprise flights on his airline. Sometimes he dressed like a farmer, sometimes like a businessman, and sometimes like a regular tourist. He wanted to see how his employees treated all different types of passengers. Most of the time, Harold was pleased with what he saw. His employees had learned the lesson from Jessica's mistake. They treated all passengers with kindness and respect. But occasionally, Harold would find an employee who was not following company values. When this happened, Harold would use it as another teaching opportunity. He would explain why good customer service mattered and help the employee understand how to do better. Harold's airline became known throughout the industry for having the best customer service. Passengers chose to fly with his airline because they knew they would be treated well, no matter who they were or what they looked like. And Harold? He continued to live simply on his farm in Nebraska, growing vegetables and raising chickens. He never forgot that success and wealth should not change how you treat other people. Every morning when Harold put on his simple clothes and old boots, he remembered the important lesson he had learned many years ago, that how you treat people says everything about who you are as a person. And every day, Harold made sure that his airline lived up to the promise he had made 30 years earlier, that every passenger matters, and every journey counts. The story of Harold Jameson and Jessica Martinez became a legend in the airline industry. It reminded everyone that appearances can be deceiving, that respect should be given to all people, and that true success comes from treating others with kindness and dignity. Harold's simple farm clothes had taught the world a valuable lesson. Never judge a person by how they look, because you never know who they might really be.